Alrighty again, here we are back on our studies of 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 1 through 8. We began in part 1 with an introductory session. It was somewhat longer than what I usually do. I couldn't help that. I did everything I could to cut it down. And so I hope you listen to that, because it is extremely important to get that first one and to get a really great grasp on the context of 2 Corinthians 2:14 all the way through 2 Corinthians 6 verse 16, so that you can hone in to 2 Corinthians 5 1 through 8 as the hub and see how the context surrounds it and helps us accurately interpret what Paul was talking about when it comes to the idea of the clothing of the habitation of God from heaven. And then in part 2, we dealt with only verse 1, because verse 1, somewhat like the context, is extremely important because it sets up the specific context, verses 2 through 8. And so if you've not listened to part 2, where we spent 40 minutes on verse 1, I ask that you please do that as well before you listen to this one. And don't forget to go to my site, asiteforthelord.com, and download my PDF transcript. That way you can follow along, since this study, unlike most of my other ones, is a little bit more technical in that I deal with Greek terms, the syntax and the tenses of them and all that. That was mainly, in fact, with reference to chapter 5 verse 1. I won't be dealing with that as much this time, but you still need to, of course, go ahead and download the PDF and follow along if there's any way you can, or at least have it to where you can go back over it later at some point in time and be able to keep it fresh in your mind, and maybe even write me an email or a note through the website and ask questions or make comments or help me smooth this out to where it makes more sense and is better. But this morning, today is the 18th of July, and a Wednesday at 7:20 in the morning. So let's begin with 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and this morning looking at verses 2 and 3. I think we'll probably stick with that. I'll look at the time and see how I'm going. But let's look at verses 2 and 3, and we're going to do as I did with verse 1 and break it down into phrases and maybe even single words. And I'm reading from the New King James. Verse 2 begins with the word for. Just like with the word for in verse 1, this one connects to chapter 4 and verse 16. Chapter 4, verse 16, remember, is where Paul brought up the whole concept. I think actually, if I were to divide this whole context of chapter 2 through chapter 6, if I were to divide it up myself into chapters, I think I would have put chapter 5 verse 1 beginning at where 4 and 16 is. But that's really difficult to figure out, because practically anywhere you decide to put a chapter or even a verse is somewhat difficult due to how things flow, and you're trying to keep people from disconnecting things from their context. But back in chapter 4 verse 16, Paul said, "Therefore do not lose heart." And see, it even sounds like it would be a good spot for a chapter break, whereas in chapter 5 verse 1 it just says, "For we know." What that sounds like. You're in the middle of a thought. At least with chapter 4 verse 16, it says, "Therefore do not lose heart. For even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. Now, we've already talked a couple of times about how that the old outward man of that verse takes our minds back to the old covenant man of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the chapter right before this one. And the inward man of 4:16 takes our minds back to the new covenant man of the Spirit in chapter 3 as well. And how that the old covenant was in the process at this time of fading away or perishing, as 4:16 says, and how the inward man was coming to life, that is, being renewed day by day to the fullness of life. And so there's that corporate concept, the covenant, which is comprised of people, a group of people. The old covenant and its group of people was fading away, but those who of the remnant had come out of that old covenant and accepted the new covenant, that group with its covenant was coming to life. As the old was dying, the new was coming to life, like the seed that we mentioned also before a couple times in John 12, verse 24, as well as 1 Corinthians 15. And then Paul says, for our light affliction, which is for a moment, is working us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, which takes our minds back to chapter 3 as well, about the glory of the new covenant far exceeding that of the old covenant. And verse 18, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. The things that are seen of the old covenant, things which are not seen, being spiritual, are of the new covenant. For the things which are seen, things of the old covenant, are temporary, physical and temporary. But the things which are not seen are eternal and spiritual, I might add, because that's the contrast, physical versus spiritual, temporary versus eternal. And so based on that idea of the old perishing and the new coming to life, Paul in verse 1 said, for we know that if our earthly tent, this house, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. So I think the 4 in verse 2 also goes back to verse 16, or even 16 through chapter 5, verse 1. You know, the entire set of 4 verses there. For in this we groan, Paul said in verse 2. The word this, of course, refers back to tent of verse 1. The tent, or a tabernacle, which was, in their minds, as well as in this context, the symbol of the old covenant world in which they were then living, which takes our minds back. If you listen to the last talk or read my notes for verse 1, the word earth, epigeios, and we talked about how that the root word of that, which is ge in Greek, means land, and it refers to the land of Israel. And we talked about all that, so that should be well placed in our minds, and how that fits right into the context of the hour and the we, and how Paul was referring to himself and the apostles and the Jewish Christians, the Jews who had accepted Christ, the Jews who had come, and the Israelites who had come out of the old covenant mode of life and were now in a new covenant and were working their way up toward the finished product of the new covenant, the established new covenant, as Hebrews 10:9 talks about in the present tense, where Jesus taking away the old in order to establish the new, and so that the new would have be a covenant all on its own. So the whole tabernacle idea of verse 1 fits right into the picture of how that the tabernacle was the very thing that represented and signified the old covenant life, the old covenant world. So the word this in verse 2 refers back to that tent, back to that tabernacle. In this, that is, in this world, Paul is saying, this tabernacle, this tent, this old covenant temple world, in this, he said, we groan. Verse 4 even supports this, saying, we, plural, who are in this tent, singular, groan. See that idea right here? This is singular. We is plural. For in this, that is in that old covenant, cultus, religion, we groan. We as the Jewish people, the Israelite people, and especially, you might say, the Christians who had accepted the new covenant out of the old, but they were still under the old in the sense that the old was still in existence, and they were being persecuted by their quote-unquote brethren, Jewish, Hebrew brethren. And that's what Paul had talked about in chapter 4, the persecution that what they were going through or enduring because of this transitioning from one covenant to another. So until the people of the old covenant, till the old covenant and its people were fulfilled and removed at AD 70, they were in the process of groaning over all the persecution that they were having to endure. The word groan is our next one to look at. Now, if we're going to continue using the Bible to explain the Bible, especially when the information comes from more than 2 or more letters penned by the same author, then beginning at this point in 2 Corinthians 5, it's necessary to consult Romans 8. Romans 8 is written by Paul. 2 Corinthians 5 is written by Paul. And Paul refers to and alludes to the same concepts in both places. So let's look a little bit at Romans 8. I have an entire, probably 35-minute discussion on Romans 8, 18 through 23 on my website. The notes, the transcript is there. I have a YouTube audio on that one, and I love that one. Romans 8 and 2 Peter 3 are two of my favorite passages to discuss. And so you can, if you want to, even pause here and go read my notes on Romans 8 or listen to the discussion on Romans 8. And it will be even better than what I'm going to share with you here, because this is just a couple of minutes worth of information. Okay, so I will read it though. So that will take more than a couple of minutes. So Romans 8, 18 through 23 fits perfectly into our discussion here of 2 Corinthians 5, verse 2, and the groaning that he was referring to. Paul said in Romans 8, 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time," see, that part right there even takes us back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that Paul had alluded to, the sufferings and so on, before he got into chapter 5. Continuing here, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which is about to be revealed in us." That is the Greek word there. Instead of shall be, it is the Greek word melo, which means about to be. So he's talking about the present time, how that during the present time, during the AD 50s, Romans was written real close to the same time as 2 Corinthians, which is probably why he talks about the same thing in both of them, because it was written just almost back to back. Okay, so you have Paul saying some of the same stuff here. He's talking about the present time. He talked about their suffering at the hands of the persecutors, which were his own Hebrew brethren who were not accepting Jesus as Messiah and were therefore persecuting the Christians and so on. He said, these sufferings that we're going through are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is about to be revealed in us. Verse 19, "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God." Now that fits 2 Corinthians 5. Verse 18 fits 2 Corinthians 4. Verse 19 fits 2 Corinthians 5. The revealing of the sons of God. That has to do with the revelation, has to do with the revealing through resurrection. 4, verse 20, "The creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now, and not only they, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even as we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. There's so much I want to say as I go through that because of the information in my other lesson on this, but I need to keep it short here to get through 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So this Romans 8 paragraph must be kept in its chapters 4 through 8 context of Romans. Okay? All those chapters that lead up to chapter 8 of Romans, especially from 4 onward, are really significant. In chapter 4, it speaks of how true righteousness and salvation for all men must come by faith. And chapter 5 speaks of Jesus being the answer to man's problem with law and his need for grace. Then chapter 6 speaks of their being baptized into Christ, picturing their future resurrection to life, which would not be through or due to law. Then chapter 7 speaks of how the law essentially did nothing but frustrate God's created or chosen people via Abraham. Hint, hint, creation is talking about people, not plants and animals and dirt. And Abraham was made righteous by faith, chapter 4. And lastly, in chapter 5, it speaks of the fulfillment of the resurrection life promised in chapter 6 to those of God's created people who grueled through that transitional process, forever leaving behind their bondage to corruption caused by law, or rather man's inability to be righteous by law. Okay, that's chapters 4 through 8 in a nutshell of Romans. How that chapter 8 is essentially the conclusion of those chapters, the climax. So not only is the word groan used here in 2 Corinthians 5 verses 2 and 4, but it's also of the same original word Paul used in Romans 8 verse 23 and in the same type of context. The groaning Paul spoke of here in 2 Corinthians 5 was specifically said to be due to their earnest desire to be clothed upon with the heavenly habitation. See verse 4, which we may not get to today in this lesson, but it says, "We who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by immortality or life." So how can we not see how Romans 8, 18 through 23 is talking about the same thing? So I think it really is important to listen to my talk on Romans 8 to get a much better hold on 2 Corinthians 5. But obviously, again, we don't have time to get that deeply into it. But you can see if you go back and forth between the two chapters, especially 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 4, and Romans 8, 18 through 23, and how the resurrection concept is found in both, resurrecting them out from among the groaning they were going through due to all the persecution they were having to go through during this transition period they were having to endure because of those old covenant brethren who were against the Christians at this time. You know, they were trying to destroy Christianity and using Rome to do it. So, especially if we're desperately wanting to go from a negative situation to a positive one, you know, isn't that the way we all do when we're going through any sort of transition? Just think about some transition in your life, in your personal life, where you're having to go from one stage in your life to another stage, and the feeling of needing to just really get through that to get to your goal, what you were really after. We do that on a daily basis. Practically everything we do transitions from a beginning to an ending. Like right now, am trying to get through verse 2? Those Jewish Christians saw how that their old covenant clothing was nearly worn out, like we read from Hebrews chapter 1 verse 11 in the last talk, or in the introductory talk, I can't remember which one it was, where we talked about Hebrews 1:11. And they saw that. They were in a covenant clothing that was wearing down, wearing out, about to pass away, about to be folded up and put away or thrown away, whatever the case might be, however you want to look at it. Paul said it was perishing. It had come to the point that they would have been found naked had they not already had something prepared to cover them, thus a transition. Like a poor beggar who had been promised new clothing and shelter, they were groaning with impatience for that to finally be a finished product. James 5 verse 7 might come to mind as you're thinking about what I'm saying here. James 5 verse 7, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. And then he said in verse 8, the coming of the Lord is at hand. They were going through this transition, this transformation, as the word is used in 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18, which is right in our context here. And Paul is just saying, we just have to be patient. That's what James was saying, at least, and I'm sure that's what Paul was wanting them to do, is to be patient. This is happening. We are in the midst of it right now. But it will finally happen, come to an end. This groaning that you're having to deal with. Paul said Paul was part of it. Paul was in it more so than the rest of them were, as he talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We are groaning as we go through this process of putting off an old set of clothing and putting on a new set of clothing. So he said, for in this we groan. In this situation, we are groaning. Earnestly desiring was his next phrase. This phrase is from one strong Greek term, which I don't believe coincidentally is found in Psalm 84, verses 1 through 4. Note the plain probability that Paul had this very Old Testament text in mind. Here's how it reads. How lovely is your tabernacle, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, yes, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young. Even your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God, blessed are those who dwell in your house. What a perfect passage. It fits right in here, where it's like this was the passage Paul was thinking of as they were going through this process, this groaning process, this almost like a birthing process, And he's thinking, oh, I love your tabernacle. He's talking about the new covenant one, not the old covenant one. How lovely is your tabernacle. And my soul longs for that. That's what Paul is saying. We long for the final coming in its fullness and its established situation of the new covenant world, new covenant life, new covenant mode of existence, that clothing. He wanted to have that fully put on as the other was taken completely off and put away. Likewise, Psalm 119, 174 says, I long for your salvation, which would be realized in God's shelter and his house and his clothing. We constantly pray in our prayers to God, thanking him for our clothing and our shelter. our food and so on, physically. Well, that's what they were doing spiritually. They were longing for the spiritual food and the spiritual clothing and the spiritual shelter or house that we're talking about here. And they were about to get it. Their prayers were about to be answered. It wasn't long after the mid-50s when things finally started coming to fruition. But anyway, Paul is saying, for in this world now, we are groaning. I'm not saying the world as in the globe or the universe. I'm talking about the world, that eastern part of the world in Palestine, in the Roman Empire, the world in which they were living at this time and suffering what they were suffering because of the transition they were going through. In this world we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with that of the next world, or the next age. Jesus talked about this age and the age to come. That's what Paul's dealing with here as well. They were still in this age. That is the age of the old covenant mode of existence. But the new covenant was coming out of it. It was being birthed out of it. That's why Jesus used the whole birthing concept in Matthew 24 when he talked about the destruction of Jerusalem and how that it was going to bring to fruition the fulfillment of all things related to prophecy. Luke 21, verse 22. In Matthew 24, those where he used, in verse 8 I think it is, the idea of pregnancy and of labor pains and giving birth, because through the ending and the fulfillment of all prophecy at the time of Jerusalem's destruction, at the coming of Christ in that destruction, there would be the birth finally of the finished product of the new covenant and the kingdom, as Luke 21 also has Jesus saying in verses 31 and 32. Anyway, I can just keep going on with all of that because Paul himself even used that same analogy in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So Paul said, for in this world, this situation, these circumstances, we are groaning, earnestly desiring, as Psalm 84 talked about, to be clothed. As scholars such as Vincent Thayer note, the Greek term here isn't just from the term to clothe, as this transition makes it sound, or this translation makes it sound, sorry. It's from a word which means to clothe over, to put on over, like they were putting on Christ. So what's the point? From what we'll consider soon and discover in verse 4, I believe Paul was using this term to exaggerate. That is, as we'll get more into momentarily when we talk about the term naked, he was speaking about clothing which would cover them completely once and for all time. Okay? Again, say it once more. The Greek term that was used here for to be clothed is a little stronger than what we normally think of in clothing. It's to put on over, to completely cover once and for all. Something that's not going to get ratty. Something that's not going to become worn out and have to be removed and replaced. The point is that God wasn't going to allow his people to experience a point in time in which they would be unclothed, uncovered, uncovenanted, we could say. Since Paul expounded upon this in verse 4, we'll say more about it when we get there. So, in and with, what did Paul say this plurality of persons would be clothed? Well, much like in verse 1, where Paul wrote of a building from God in the heavens, so here he wrote of their being clothed with our habitation from heaven. That's the next phrase, our habitation from heaven. Though the terms are related, the word habitation here isn't a translation of oikia as house in verse 1. Rather, this original term, okaterion, places special emphasis on the inhabitants of a house. Sort of how we today understand the term home, as opposed to house. We think of a house as the building and the home being the people in it. So that's sort of the idea here. A house versus home. Oikia versus oikaterion. So it's an idea more closely related to the word home later in verses 6 and 8, actually. While our home is in the body, we are absent from our home with the Lord. We would gladly leave our home in the body and make our home with the Lord. That's a 20th century New Testament version of verses 6 and 8. I think it's important to note that Paul said, our habitation from heaven, corresponding with the now but not yet principle that we talked about in the introductory lesson, and his we have phrase in verse 1, reminiscent again of the youth who's about to inherit his fortune. In other words, it's a now but not yet. They have it, but they don't have it. They have it to the point that they know it's definitely going to happen. There's no doubt that it's going to happen. But it's our habitation. He's saying it's not that they have it, but he can say our habitation because he knows they're going to have it. It's all transitional talk. If you don't believe in a transition between AD 30 and AD 70, and if you don't believe in a transition that was going on during the last generation of Israel and the first generation of the church, this stuff is not going to make any sense. And this administrative home that Paul was talking about, this administrative home was from heaven, because at this time it, per verse 1, was in heaven. And you can check out, like I said last time, in the last discussion of verse 1, check out Galatians 4, 21 through 31, and Revelation 21, verse 10, and then verses 1 through 4, and then compare Revelation 21, 4 with 2 Corinthians 5, verse 17. Anyway, all that's in my notes, so you can have those to look back on later. Then Paul went on to say, in the next phrase, if indeed having been clothed. The if here is not from the doubtful condition term that we talked about in verse 1. In verse 1, it was EAN, which, as we noted there, is the word that is conditional, usually. Not always, as we discussed, but usually EAN is translated if because it carries this conditional idea with it. Here, it's the Greek word EI. This one is from the no doubt condition term, meaning when or since. Whereas EAN can mean no doubt, but usually doesn't. EI always means no doubt. When or since is actually the better translation. So Paul was saying, when indeed having been clothed. That's the thing. That's the idea right there. When indeed having been clothed. He's giving them encouragement, saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's our habitation. We have it. We're in the process of being clothed. And when all that happens, we shall not be found naked. Also, clothed here is the term found in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 53. I had mentioned to you in the very first talk, the introductory talk, that 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8 should be studied before 1 Corinthians 15. That's why it's hard for me to not be going to 1 Corinthians 15 when we're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 53, Paul said, for this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortality must put on immortality. Those words put on, the same word used here for clothing. Clothing oneself. They were going to be clothed with the new covenant. Once it has been established, they would be completely clothed, but they're in the process right now of it happening. It wasn't there yet. They're in this transitional situation. So they're putting off, in the process of putting off the old clothing of the old covenant and putting on, clothing themselves with the new covenant clothing. Then Paul said, we, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. Firstly, this is the same we Paul had been talking about all along in this extended context, namely himself and the other suffering Jewish Christians. Secondly, the original term for found means exactly that, to be seen or found as. Seen or found by whom? Jesus. Paul didn't want to be found by him without having on his wedding garment. Check out Matthew 22 verse 11 in context. Garment is related to clothed here. Garment in Matthew 22 is related to the clothing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Go back over to Matthew 22 and read that parable, that story, noting how that in verse 7, the wedding of Jesus to his bride, the groom to the church, took place at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Thirdly, the implication is that if they weren't found with the new covenant clothing that was provided, they'd be considered naked. If you were in the old covenant and you rejected Jesus as the Messiah promised in that old covenant by Moses himself, if you were in that covenant and did not leave that covenant to enter into the new covenant, which meant you would have accepted Jesus, then you'd be found naked when he returned. That's what Matthew 22 is about. You'd be found naked. These Jewish Christians here to whom Paul is writing, they weren't going to be found naked. Once the old covenant passed away, once the old covenant clothing was put away because it was fulfilled, they'd be clothed. They'd have the clothing of the new covenant. Fourthly, due to the adjacent context as well as the remote context, I believe that the clothing Paul had in mind was the cloak of righteousness. The cloak or coat, the clothing of righteousness, without which they'd be considered unprepared to meet their Redeemer in wedded bliss. After all, the main point of the transition period was to purify and prepare the bride for marriage. That's what sanctification is. The whole sanctification concept in the New Testament is about the time of purifying the bride through that generation. The idea of sanctification being a process that happens with every individual through his life or her life is not what the Bible is talking about. The sanctification that's talked about in the New Testament had to do with sanctifying the bride in preparation for her wedding to the Lord at the time the old covenant bride was destroyed. 2,000 years ago almost, 80, 70, when Jesus could be free then to marry the new bride. Anyway, that's a beautiful topic and subject that I really like getting off into, so I need to stop myself here. Righteousness is often spoken of in the Bible as a robe or a cloak, something of an outer garment visible to everybody. Job said, I put on righteousness and it clothed me like a robe. Job 29:14. Just think back to Eden. Adam and Eve's physical nakedness and how they reacted to it after eating of the tree of knowledge is a sign of their having come to a realization of their spiritual nakedness. And just as man couldn't make an acceptable covering for his physical nakedness, God having to make it for him, so man can't make an acceptable covering for his spiritual nakedness, God having to supply that one as well. I read that incorrectly, but that's the idea, okay? Just like God had to make the clothing for Adam and Eve, So God has to make the clothing for his new covenant people. Same thing. It has to come from God, from heaven, not at the hands of men. And we already talked about that in verse 1. As Isaiah 64 verse 6 reads, all our righteous deeds are like a filthy garment, or our righteous acts are as a garment passing away. Isaiah 64 verse 6 comes right into our picture here, fitting in with Matthew 22:11 and context, and 2 Corinthians chapter 5, of course, as well as Romans chapter 8. Now notice the wedding idea found in Isaiah 61 verse 10. As a bride adorns herself, so God has covered me with the garment of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. Isaiah 61 is a prophetic chapter about the events of the first century. So you have Isaiah 64:6, Isaiah 61:10, and Isaiah chapters 65 and 66 all deal with the new heavens and new earth replacing the old heavens and old earth. The whole concept of putting off one thing and having it be replaced with something else, with there being no time in between when there could be a point of nakedness. Because one covenant leaves, another one is already there. There's already that transition taking place. So there's no time for nakedness. Whereas if you say the old covenant ended at the cross and the new covenant started in Acts chapter 2, after the ascension of Christ, you have a point in time between the cross and the church's beginning in Acts 2 of 50 days without there being any covenant at all. And yet people balk at there being two covenants at the same time in this whole transition concept. I'd have a lot more trouble with there being no covenant at all for some point in time, 50 days or whatever, than I would with there being covenants overlapping. Because that, to me, is a picture of grace. By the way, earlier, God prophesied of the old covenant that it will grow old like a garment, and those who dwell in it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished. Isaiah 51 verse 6, an idea alluded to by Jesus in Matthew 24:35, and Paul in Hebrews 1:10 through 12. In Revelation, Jesus said that he who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments. And I counsel you to buy from me white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed. And blessed is he who keeps his garments, lest he be found naked. You can find that again, Revelation chapter 3, verses 5 and 18. Jesus wasn't speaking of physical nakedness in these statements. No, he was speaking of spiritual nakedness, a life lacking Christ's robe of righteousness, the complete robe of which would be theirs in the fulfilled new heavens and earth. Yes, I am saying that the righteousness of Christ was not imputed until he returned for his bride at AD 70, when the old bride was destroyed for her spiritual adultery. That's exactly what I'm saying. Romans 4:24, which was written in the mid-AD 50s, places righteousness in the future, even though they were Christians already. They had not received righteousness of Christ yet. Same thing with Galatians chapter 5, verse 5. They were hoping for righteousness. Well, they were already Christians, but they were still hoping for righteousness. They were in a transition period. They were seen as righteous in a sense, because if they died during the transition period, they were still going to be fine. But that righteousness would not be imputed until Jesus returned for the bride. And then those who had died before that would finally get actual righteousness imputed to them, and then they'd be forever in a relationship with God. I don't know what the difficulty is about that, that some people have, but that also fits perfectly into the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24 and following. We can't live without this clothing of righteousness. 2 Peter 3:13, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells. So 2 Peter says the same thing as what I just mentioned with Romans 4 and Galatians 5. Righteousness was in the future of 2 Peter 3. Not far. It was really close at the time 2 Peter was written, but it was still in the future. They were looking for the new heavens and new earth, clothing, so to speak, in which dwells righteousness. Besides these verses, in the context of 2 Corinthians 5 verse 2, Paul wrote of righteousness, a righteousness only to be found within the confines of the new covenant. Chapter 3 verse 9, chapter 5 verse 21, chapter 6 verse 7, and chapter 6 verse 14. Chapter 6 verse 14 says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness. Chapter 6, 4 and 7. We commend ourselves as ministers of God by the armor of righteousness on the right hand and on the left. Chapter 5:21. God made Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Chapter 4, 2 through 3. We have renounced the hidden things of shame, shame being the very effect of nakedness. Adam and Eve. Not walking in craftiness or handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of truth. A very righteous passage. Chapter 3, verse 9. Since the ministry of condemnation, that is the old covenant, had glory, the ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory. But since I'm convinced that 2 Corinthians 5 is an obvious parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, then certainly I can't neglect verse 34 of 1 Corinthians 15. Awake to righteousness and do not sin, for some do not have the knowledge of God. And I speak this to your shame, your nakedness. There's just so much here that's beautiful to look at, but we don't have time to get so deep into it. And fifthly, just for more information concerning the Bible and how the nakedness is often employed as a motif for sinfulness, lawlessness, insubordination, unrighteousness, rebellion, and so on, that which only God has the power to cover, here are a few Old Testament passages. After Aaron had calmed down the Israelites by having them make a golden calf, Exodus 32:25 says, Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame. There it is, nakedness and shame. That's what would happen to those old covenant people who did not accept Jesus and the new covenant. Due to a bad king's influence, 2 Chronicles 28 and 19 says that the Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he made Judah naked and thus transgressed sore against the Lord. Speaking of Jerusalem's affliction due to her sins against God, Lamentations 1:8 reads, Jerusalem has sinned gravely, therefore she has become vile. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. And in Ezekiel 16:7 through 12, we find God's love for Jerusalem being demonstrated by covering or covenanting with her. And now my note here tells me to read that passage, but I'm going to not do that. To save time, you can go do that yourself. It's a beautiful passage. So, with the judgment in mind, John recorded Jesus as saying, Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk or be found naked. Revelation 16:15. See, keeping garments. That means you're not leaving the garment you are being clothed with during the transition into the new covenant. They were being clothed. He says, you keep that happening. If you don't, you're going to be found naked. Because the old covenant is going to cease to exist. There will be no covenant when Jesus returns if you are not in the new one. Okay, well, that's verses 2 and 3. And it looks like I spent more time on this than I was hoping to, and I apologize for that. I'm going to quit here, and we'll get to verse 4 next time around. So I thank you for putting up with me, for listening this long, and I look forward to sharing some more with you on this wonderful passage of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It's one of my favorites.